Hello. So as you all know, now we have signal forms in Angular. And though it's still experimental, still a brand new feature that is not stable, I thought I would record this quick video to show you a few tips and tricks and a few ideas that we can use with signal forms. So in this example, I have a basic form where I capture user information, first name, last name, street, zip code, city, etc., etc. And I have some requirements like first name is required, zip code is required and has to follow a specific pattern and all of these sorts of things. So typical things you would do in a form, some basic validation, some basic data entry. Now, the thing with this is that it works just like it used to work with, let's say, a template-driven form. But one thing we had with template-driven forms that we kind of lost, at least for now, with signal forms is validation that provides visual feedback out of the box. And what I mean by this is that in this example, see we have some red border on the side here, and that's because when my form is invalid, Angular automatically goes and applies these classes here. So pristine, invalid, and touched. And so as I play with my form, these are going to get updated, and so I can use those CSS classes to provide visual feedback to the user. For instance, in this example, I implemented a ng-valid class. So when a form input is of type text, and it's valid and it's required, I add a 5-pixel solid green border to the left. And if it's an invalid text box, that border is red. So that's why here we see that red border, it's invalid, so this style gets applied. If I go here, type something, now it turns green because the class turned to ng-valid. And so we get that style applied with a green border. So this feature of automatically applying a CSS class, it's not there in signal forms, at least not yet. And I thought, okay, how can I repair that? How can I get to the same result with a little bit of Angular code? And so that's what I'm going to walk you through now, showing what the idea would be and how I would go about fixing that or adding that feature to signal forms. So the first thing is that when we use signal forms, we have one single directive that we use, which is field. And we apply that field directive to all of our inputs and drop-downs and all of our form elements, right? And so the first idea would be, okay, if I want to apply some specific styles to those elements, I have access to them thanks to the directive, right? Thanks to the field directive. So I would think that maybe a good approach to fix the issue we just mentioned was to extend that directive and then override some of its behavior. Not override, but change it a little bit, right? So let's try that. I'm going to go here and generate a new directive, so ng-gd, and I'm going to call it styled field, just so we have a different name. So the CLI is going to create it, I can open it. That's my style field directive for now. Now, the selector, instead of using the default selector here, I want to use the same selector that Angular is using right now, which, as we know, is just field. So I'm going to use that same value as a selector, like this, so that my style field directive is going to apply wherever we use a field selector. Now, I don't want to reinvent everything that field already does for me. So I'm going to extend the existing field directive from Angular signal forms, takes a generic of type T, and say that my style field here is also going to be of type T. So that way we are consistent and we basically, implement the contract that field expects of us. Now, the next step would be to just listen to what's going on in that field. And we know that it's a signal form, right? So everything is based on signal, and one of these signals that has the information that we need is the state signal. So because I'm extending field, I have access to that state signal by doing this dot state. And I can use that signal to get notified when the validity of the form changes, which is really what our end goal is here. And when that value changes, I want to apply a class or remove it. So how are we going to do that? If I want to apply a class or remove it in Angular, we have something called host binding, right? And so this means you're going to bind to the host element, so the element that has this directive applied to it. And so what we want to change is a CSS class, and the class we want to apply is going to be, let's say, ng-valid or ng-invalid. So I'll start with valid. And let's say I'm going to call this property ng-valid, and by default I can make it false, right? So that's my ng-valid binding. And now all of these properties, they go in pairs in Angular. So there's valid, there's invalid. So I'm going to create the opposite binding for invalid and call it ng-invalid. And basically we're going to make it the opposite of valid, right? So that gives us the data binding, the part that's going to apply the class or remove it based on these values. If ng-valid is true, the ng-valid class gets applied. If it's false, the class gets removed, and this ng-invalid class would get applied instead. So now we have the mechanism to put the classes in place. But when do we change them? When do we apply or remove those classes? That's where we need to figure out a way to listen to that state signal update. And so we mentioned computed earlier, derive a new value. Here we don't want to derive a new computed value. We just want to listen to changes and update valid or invalid or all of these different state properties. So what I'm going to do is use an effect. And because I don't want to use a constructor, I can just do something like this, assign my effect to a variable, which is going to be useless. I'm not going to do anything with it. So there we go, we import effect from Angular core. Now we're ready to use it. And so what we are going to do is basically update, right, these values. So ng-valid is going to be equal to this dot state, and that state has valid or invalid. So I'm going to read the value of valid, and because we're reading that value inside an effect, the idea is that whenever the validity changes here, the effect is going to run again, and we are going to update the value of ng-valid, and updated that value is going to either apply the class or remove it, right? And so we would do something similar for ng-invalid, saying that ng-invalid is going to be, well, the opposite, right? So not this dot ng-valid. So that would be a recipe that takes our existing field directive, extends it, and now we can control, the validity state based on ng-valid, ng-invalid, and that signal. And of course, we would do that for all of the other ones. So I'm going to show you instead of writing everything by myself right now, just showing a possible solution to have the 6 same classes as what we have with, legacy, I would say, reactive forms and template-driven forms. So valid, invalid, pristine, dirty, touched, untouched. So just adding more of these bindings, and in our effect, we would just, follow the same idea and listen to that state and update the classes as a result. And so yeah, that would work. That would solve the issue very nicely. We would be able to apply that class whenever we use field. Now the thing to not forget, and that's what I'm going to show you next, is that in our app now, where I use my form, instead of importing field from Angular Forms signal, it's important to import my styled field instead, right? And import it from the right place so that this is the directive that's going to come into play and get used whenever we use fields in our template. So the template doesn't change. I can keep it like this. I'm just going to use the same selector. The difference is now that instead of using Angular's field directive, it's going to go and use our style field, which is just a small extension to it, really. And that style field is adding that behavior of doing some extra styling. So I like that example because it shows us how we can use directives to really extend what the framework does. And I know it's one of the things that people don't always think about, using directives to implement new features. But in that specific scenario, it just makes perfect sense. We don't want to create a component or a service or whatever. The directive is perfect for that. And by using these few tricks we saw here, like customizing the selector, extending the existing directive class, and then relying on object-oriented features and data bindings and an effect, we basically fix all of that with just a few lines of code, which I thought was really nice and interesting. So if you want me to do more videos like this one in the future, please let me know in the comments. Feel free to like that video, and yeah, I'll do more over the next few months. So thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something new.